first, before we go into anything, how do you feel about all of this arguments over the 14th Amendment? Like how like initially, like, are you like shocked that we're even talking about it still, that it hasn't been like solved for yet?
I can't say that. I feel like I'm too deep in this now to even be there. Like, we first brought this up months ago as far as the conversation, the discussion point of whether Trump was eligible to run or not. So now I'm so deep that I'm just trying to figure out what is true and what isn't. Like, is he eligible?
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure it out for myself before even anyone else does.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's do it.
So the context here, this happened, like right after we recorded our last episode, which has now been a while because we had the holiday break. But in Colorado, the state Supreme Court ruled 4-3 that Trump committed insurrection and that the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment meant that he was not eligible to be on the ballot and that he wouldn't be in the Republican primary. This came off the back of the appeals court asserting that Trump had committed insurrection, but that Section 3 didn't apply to him because of nuances in the wording. We talked about this on a previous episode. Basically, they decided that the 14th Amendment applied to everyone but the president, which is insane.
Because for some weird reason, the 14th Amendment does not specifically outline the president, but does specifically outline other offices to the Constitution. But because the president wasn't explicitly listed, they were like, okay, he committed insurrection, but the whole insurrection clause doesn't apply to the presidency.
It's funny. I got, again, getting so deep into this, I read a New York Times article that actually, an opinion piece that made a pretty convincing argument that the 14th Amendment, that Section 3 wasn't supposed to apply to the presidents.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I was starting to be like, this is crazy. But then there was a piece put out by the Congressional Research Office that noted that cited a research paper that was going over the history of writing that amendment, and they found that, or the research paper cited a conversation that happened in Congress where someone specifically asked, like, why is the president not included here? And the person responded basically, that's irrelevant. It would never matter. So clearly the problem isn't that the president was specifically supposed to be excluded. They just thought it would never really amount to anything because after the Civil War, they weren't really considering another insurrection happening and someone who committed that insurrection even being considered for president.
They weren't even thinking that the country would be dumb enough to elect an insurrectionist as the president.
Exactly.
And we know that because I guess we have conversations on the congressional floor saying, like, the American people aren't that stupid.
Exactly.
No one's going to do that. Well, here we are.
We fucking are. Yeah, so both the voters who want to keep Trump off the ballot, the Colorado Republican Party, and as of a few days ago, or I think maybe yesterday, Trump himself have all asked the Supreme Court to take up the case. So we've built the momentum. This kind of has to happen now.
And I want to make it clear, the guys who brought this case were a group of independents and Republicans. It wasn't even Democrats that brought the case into Colorado. Yeah. This wasn't like a partisan thing. It was literally independents and Republicans that brought this to the Colorado appeals court or whatever and tried to get Trump off the ballot. It wasn't Democrats.
Exactly. So unfortunately now we're at a point where timelines are extremely tight. They've requested that the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, decides whether to take the case by this Friday, which is tomorrow, and rule by February 11th because Colorado's primary is on Super Tuesday, which is March 5th. So hopefully they take it. If they decline to take the case, then Trump will be excluded from Colorado's primary ballot. Then off the back of this, in Maine, the Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows, who is a Democrat, ruled that Trump was ineligible as per the 14th Amendment. She said, I am mindful that no Secretary of State has ever deprived a presidential candidate of ballot access based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I am also mindful, however, that no presidential candidate has ever before engaged in insurrection. Badass.
Yeah, kind of a badass. And you know, it makes it so much easier for her to say this because now we have courts on the record saying Trump committed insurrection.
Yes.
We have appeals courts across the country. We have one of the state Supreme Courts saying that, yes, Donald Trump committed insurrection. That makes these Secretary of States who do this have some legs to it.
Yes, they do. It's interesting that it gets into the procedural element of creating ballots, right? Because it means that Secretaries of State, it's not clear because we're in such new legal territory of like what the standard for committing insurrection or inciting insurrection is.
Yeah.
So these secretaries of state, when they think about making their ballots, it's kind of on them to decide whether or not they think Trump is eligible. And Bellows was the first one who made that decision that she couldn't, or that Trump couldn't be on it. In other states like California, Trump was put on the ballot, but that's because there are specific differences in the state laws that give powers to the Secretary of State to exclude anyone who is ineligible from the ballot. California doesn't have that law. Yep. Michigan also doesn't have that law. So they're not keeping Trump off their ballot either.
Are they taking anything to the state Supreme Court in Michigan? Do we know?
I think there was a case there a case that was dismissed at one point. I think the Supreme Court dismissed a case, and all they said is, we are not persuaded that the questions presented should be reviewed by this court. One justice wrote a dissent, which basically explained this point, that while Colorado law makes it clear that political parties can only put forward qualified candidates, Michigan law does not make that distinction.
Gotcha. But then let's get into discussing this here, because I think it's who decides who's qualified. It's a really, really hard question, because the 14th Amendment has no enforcement mechanism written into it. So it's really hard to make the determination, who is it? Does someone have to be like criminally charged with insurrection and proven without a reasonable doubt? Or is it something that can just be done through a court order and a judge determines you broke the 14th Amendment?
There is some precedent that says that inciting insurrection gets you kicked off, and that it doesn't have to be a conviction. That there have been moments in cases before, or I think when the amendment was first relevant after the Civil War, where people didn't have to be charged by the law with insurrection, and yet they were still barred from running for office.
Right.
So I don't think he needs to be criminally convicted for it to apply.
Yeah. There's an interesting argument that I've heard. I think there was actually one of the opinions, or maybe it was in the dissent of the Colorado Supreme Court case, where the author of the dissent said that we don't have the authority to do this, that we don't have the authority to declare that he is
ineligible.
Ineligible. And he cited, because look, this is more complicated than a simple demographic requirement to run for president. It's not something as simple as, oh, he's over the age of 35. Oh, he was born in the United States.
Yeah.
Oh, he didn't commit insurrection. Insurrection is more of a difficult, non-objective word.
Yeah.
No matter how much we think it might be, obviously, insurrection, which I do, it still leads to that question, who is making that determination?
Yeah.
And it sucks that we don't have a direct enforcement mechanism, but I think this is the way the process is supposed to work. I think it's supposed to work its way through the courts, and I think it is supposed to go to the Supreme Court. And if not the Supreme Court, who else makes this decision? I don't know.
That's what I'm saying. Like the whole point of the court system is supposed to be to interpret not only the law, but the cases that they're given in the context of the law, right? So I think that's a really weak dissent from the Colorado Supreme Court, because if not you to decide that this was insurrection, then who?
Yeah. I guess he's saying the criminal courts, but...
Yeah, so they're saying you need a whole different case, right, to figure this out.
But you don't need a whole criminal case to prove that he's 35.
No.
Right? So that's where the arguments were kind of boiling down to in Colorado.
Yeah.
Now, do you think the Supreme Court will take it up? Or do you think they'll just move on?
God, I think they can't want to.
No, God, John Roberts must be just shitting himself right now.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this kind of wraps up. I put two questions here. Will the Supreme Court take it up, and is keeping Trump off the ballot actually worse for democracy? I think they're really tied together. I think the Supreme Court won't want to take it up, because if they have to rule that Trump committed insurrection and keep him off the ballot, it's not only the faith lost in our electoral systems, but also in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Both of which have already been eroded. And the Supreme Court, which has been teetering on the brink with these ethical violations that they've been committing. So I think they don't want to, but I also think Colorado won't be the last instance that tries to get it to the court.
Oh, yeah, no way.
And it doesn't... it's almost too important for them to decline.
Right.
Right. So I think they will. I hope they will.
Yeah, I think they will too, but I think they'll rule in Trump's favor, dude. I don't think they'll rule against. I don't think they will rule. Like, I think John Roberts will vote with the liberals, and then the only other swing votes are Amy Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh, I believe. I don't think Gorsuch would switch. I know Alito and Clarence Thomas wouldn't.
You don't think Coney Barrett might?
No, Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh are the two that may.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying Gorsuch, Alito,
yeah,
Clarence Thomas are the ones I'm convinced wouldn't.
Okay. See, based on what I read, I think that it's actually pretty clear that Trump incited insurrection.
Yeah, I think I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any argument for it. I mean, like, you could go down and make the argument. I'm sure you're going to have plenty of those arguments in the comments section of this video, but
yeah,
I don't know. We don't have the time to run through all of it, but maybe we should one day. Maybe we should just dedicate an episode deep dive into why he did an insurrection.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. They've run through so much evidence in multiple instances, but I will just say I think he did, and I think the only other point you can go off is the point that the Colorado Appeals Court made, that the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to the president.
Yeah.
And I think the historical context that I just gave makes it pretty hard to argue that it's not supposed to apply to the president.
Yeah, I mean, and the job of the courts is to figure out what the intent of every law was.
Exactly.
So if we have pretty clear evidence that the intent was, obviously this would cover the president, as long as the American people, we just don't think the American people would be that dumb.
Yeah.
Well, then there you go.
Yeah.